Looks like we're getting started. Looks like the first set of attendees are jumping in. So, hey everybody, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. We're just getting started here with our Harness CI, our inaugural Harness CI CD Dev Days. We're gonna wait about another minute or two before we get started, but very excited to be having everybody here. And yeah, let's we'll certainly have a great session today.
While everyone is joining, let us know in the chat where you're joining from. It'll be good to see where we have folks from.
Oh, the chat's disabled. I didn't recognize that. The intricacies of Zoom webinar. I don't think any of us have permission to change it. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So I guess we can go ahead and get started. Looks like the participants have smoothed out. So yeah, Dewan, why don't you take us away?
Yeah, for sure. So welcome to the very first Harness CI/CD Dev Days. Uh, Before we get started with the actual webinar, some housekeeping and agenda. The workshop is being recorded so that we can improve on the content. And also, we hope to get some feedback from you. So we'll share a feedback form at the very end. This is the workshop agenda. This will be very much hands-on. There will be demos, and our instructor will walk you through the demo. There are some breaks in the middle because of the length of the workshop. If you have any question at any point, please let us know. Either you can go off mute, you can ask your question, you can ask the question in chat. Welcome again. And about the team, my name is Dewan Ahmed. I'm a developer advocate at Harness. I live in the beautiful east coast of Canada, New Brunswick. And I've been working at Harness, focusing on our continuous delivery and GitOps module. With me, I have my colleagues, Ravi and Nick. Nick, do you want to say something about yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Nick Lotz. I am based in the Nashville, Tennessee area in the southeastern US, where we just got about half a foot of snow over the last day or so. We're definitely not used to it, but we're hanging in there. I'll be talking more later in this workshop. I'll be leading a fair bit of the hands-on demonstrations later today.
And I'm Ravi Lachhman. I'm a product manager here at Harness. So very excited for the workshop. I'm located a little bit north of Atlanta, so like right below the snow line. So like if I go like maybe 20, 30 miles north of here, it's where Nick Nick has. And so yeah, very excited. Next slide, Dawn. And so give everybody a little bit of introduction to Harness. So it looks like we have a pretty good mix of folks. So if you're unfamiliar with Harness, Harness that certainly has been evolving over the last year. So since we were founded in 2017, our mission has been helping anybody deliver software better, right? And like we kind of started out as a continuous delivery solution. We've evolved into a full-blown software delivery platform. So I was here when we had one module. Now we have 12 or 13 different modules that we have. And if you take a look at like kind of our customer list at the bottom there, what's really interesting is that it's just a wide list of different sets of folks, right? Like the going at it is like, hey, any firm is a software firm now if you're using technology to differentiate. And no matter if you're a small startup or you're a large retailer or you're a financial institution or insurance company or an airline, Harness can help you develop software or deliver software in a more efficient manner. Our workshop today will be focusing on a pair of modules. So we're going to be focusing on having yourself build something into a binary artifact. And so that's excellent. Yeah. So we're focusing on two of our core modules here, CI and CD. So the CI stage will be building a particular artifact from source and then publishing that artifact into a Docker registry. And then after that, we'll be deploying that artifact into a Kubernetes cluster, which will provide you the infrastructure for that. I'll let Dewan and Nick kind of talk a little bit more. Now, since this is our first time doing it, and there's certain, let's say, certain folks might not be able to do everything in the platform via our SaaS. So, for example, we have a hosted cloud build. If everybody got our precursor emails that we were sending out before, certain generic emails were not on there because of like crypto mining or like protections that we have. And so we'll just give you the image saying, hey, use this tag to deploy. So you don't have to build it from source. But yeah, Dewan or Nick, anything else you want to talk about before we kind of show how the lab is set up and kind of go through our learning material?
Yeah, I think you covered it mostly. So we have shared these resources. One of that is the lab guide, which goes much more in detail, but also we have a tutorial that's more lightweight. But along the way, we'll be sharing these links with you in the chat as well. But let's go over some of the theories of the lab today. So we'll be focusing on CI, CD, and GitOps. So let's learn a bit more about these terms, starting with CI. So continuous integration, or CI, is about frequently integrating code changes into a code repository and then building, testing, and packaging so that that code becomes software in the form of an artifact, for example, a Docker image. Now, when we talk about shift left, that means we want to bring this testing and integration process in the early of our development cycle. This way, we can catch any issues sooner rather than later, when it's much costly. Next, let's talk about CD, a more debated term, which is whether it's a continuous delivery, whether it's continuous deployment. So let's talk about the continuous delivery part. So this involves automating the entire software release process. This ensures that the code changes are always in a deployable state. Now, CD, which is continuous deployment, takes this automation one step further so that the deployment is happening automatically when the code changes are pushed. This makes the release boring, or the job of our sysadmins and the team is to make the release boring for the company. Now, in modern cloud-native ecosystem, it's very difficult to talk about CD without addressing GitOps. Now, GitOps leverages Git for infrastructure deployment. This is because Git has been working great for software engineers for decades. Now, this uses declarative configuration stored in repositories. Now, according to Open GitOps, which is a set of open source standards around GitOps, there are 4 principles: declarative, versioned and immutable, pulled automatically, and continuously reconciled. Now, continuous and declarative ensures desired state. That means rather than implicit shellcodes, you have your GitOps-based declarative code for your release pipeline. Because it's Git-driven, it's versioned and immutable. Rather than your CI pushing the changes to your deployment infrastructure, for example, a Kubernetes cluster, these changes are pulled in by your GitOps engine. If we look at the image there, talking about the continuously reconciled option, you can use a popular engine like Argo CD or Flux CD as the reconciler. So that pulls in the code that you declared in Git. Because we're using Harness platform in this workshop, it will be beneficial to understand some of the Harness GitOps entities. Now, this would be easier when we actually run the workshop, but these are some of the entities that will get you familiarized when you're actually doing the workshop. Now, entities are resources in Harness, So that can be your environment, your infrastructure, your application. And this is based upon a very popular model that software engineers has been using for a long time, abstraction. We abstract away our infrastructure, we abstract away our classes. So this uses that very popular and tested approach of abstraction. Most of these entities are backed by a YAML. And you can see on the right-hand side that diagram that you can have a GitOps agent that runs command in a GitOps cluster. I don't expect you to read the diagram right now, but again, if you have a mental note of each of these entities, this would be much more evident when we actually run this workshop. So the goal of the workshop is to present to you with an enterprise-grade end-to-end CI/CD pipeline. So what do I mean by that? So here, let's look at the pipeline from 10,000 feet. Our pipeline is an umbrella entity which can have one or more stages. This pipeline has 3 stages. The first one is a continuous integration stage. The next one is a continuous delivery stage for our dev environment. And then gated by an approval mechanism, we have the final stage which deploys to production environment. Let's zoom in a bit. So if we zoom in the continuous integration stage, you can have your pipeline either manually deployed or you can have it triggered by some mechanism. For example, you can have a code push in your code repository and that triggers your pipeline. Now, once that pipeline runs, it can run a bunch of security tests. So here we're using the run OWASP test as an example. And then based on, you can see there's a variable expression within the last block, which says trigger.commit SHA, just so that you can track the entire change for each pipeline run from development all the way to the deployment. We're using one example of using the commit SHA to add in your Docker image. Now let's look at how that image tag we're tracking into the different stages. So there are 2 stages. One is for the development environment and one for the production environment. We can use here Argo CD is used as a popular GitOps application model. So Argo CD application is created based on Git generator, which is sort of an application set, a custom resource definition. And here, the trigger.commit SHA gets added to one of the config files. And then GitOps automatically creates the PR for you to update your manifest. The PR gets merged, and then the linked GitOps apps get shown. So the output you can see in your pipeline. But before this change lands in production, you have an approval process. Just like most enterprise-grade CI/CD mechanism has some sort of approval process. This could be a manual approver, a Jira-based approval, or a ServiceNow approval. So once you approve, then the mirrored approach happens for the production environment. So this is what we'll see in practice today. For that, there are some prerequisites. If you haven't done already, you'll need to sign up for a Harness account. You need a GitHub account and a Docker Hub account. For both GitHub and Docker Hub, you need to create personal access token. Do not worry if you haven't created that already. My colleague Nick will explain those in details. All right, so now I'd like to hand it over to Nick, and all the best. Remember, we'll be in chat. If you have any question, you can actually come off mute and then ask us.
All right, thanks, Dewan. Yeah, as mentioned, feel free to use the Q&A feature at any point. So in just a moment, I'm going to share my screen, and there'll be a lot of me sharing the step-by-step lab guide, which you should have access to. We pasted the PDF link in chat. It was one of the first links I posted. Just to kind of set the stage here, I'll be demoing some of the prereqs as well as the full end-to-end workflow. The lab guide is meant to be prescriptive enough so that you can follow along even after the workshop. At the same time, in this workshop, we're going to offer a virtual lab environment that I'll showcase and share here in a moment for you to use as well. So we have our own hosted infrastructure that you're more than welcome to use during the course of this workshop, and I'll be demoing on that as well. I'll be demoing all of the workshop steps. My goal is to go at a pace where it's fairly, straightforward for folks to follow along. I think we have enough people in this workshop where if you do find yourself behind and you find yourself lost or in need of help, please use that Q&A function. We have several staff members here to help. And I'll try to keep pace with where most people are. And again, you'll have access to this lab guide after the workshop as well. So let me do this. Let me go ahead and share the lab guide. Again, it's just the PDF we posted. I'll screen share it as well, and I'll kind of go back and forth as I'm demoing. This first page is just the rough agenda for the workshop. What we're going to do right now is I am going to work through the CI part of CI/CD. Before we take a 10 or so minute break, which will be around the top of the next hour. And then really the bulk of the demo, the most amount of time that we'll be doing things are around advanced deployment models. So I'll certainly go through the CI steps. And then when we get to CD, that's where that'll take quite a bit of hands at the keyboard time as well. Let's go to the next page where we have this verify prerequisite step. There's a few key items we need. We mentioned these prerequisites in the initial emails that went out to the group. Number one is you will need a Harness account. So you can access that in a couple ways. There's a link here that will take you to sign up. Moreover, even if you just go to harness.io, there's a sign up button here as well, where you can create an account. Once you enter your information, you will be directed to a page. Give me one moment here. I'm going to go back. That looks something like this. So this page essentially has you choose which module you'll be using. The one we are going to focus on is the CD module. And then I know we said we're demoing both CI and CD. The one you'll want to click Get Started for is the CD module. We will include the CI related steps within CD, but you'll want to click Get Started here. Once you do, let me kind of backtrack here. It's very likely that you will arrive at a kind of pop-up screen that looks like this. If this pops up for you, we're not going to go through this UI-based flow here. Just go ahead and exit out of it. And once you're signed up, once you log in for the first time, you should arrive at this kind of blank, let me actually go up here, this blank default project. It might land on pipelines, it might not, but you shouldn't have any resources created yet. What you should have is this default project in this deployments module that you are dropped into. Couple things you need to do. And I would recommend that if you're following along, go ahead and open up a text file or a notepad file, some place where you can paste some important pieces of information. Piece of information number one is if you've signed up for Harness and you're logged in, you need to make note of your account ID. Your account ID can be found right here in the URL bar. So this is my account ID. It follows app.harness.o/account, and then this long string that's normally in kind of the middle of the URL represents your account ID. I'll make mention of this once or twice more, but take note of that and then save it if you can. What you also need to generate is, and if you haven't yet, is an API token that you can use to interact with Harness. So for the vast majority of this workshop, we'll be verifying things and working within the UI for sure, but we'll also be performing a lot of command line administration from within our virtual environments that I'll be sharing in a little bit. So you'll need a Harness API token. You can find that, and if we're following along in the labs, you can find that in step 8 on page 3. Is if I go to my little profile tile here at the bottom left, and if I click into that, and then I click into plus API key, you can enter a name for the key, and then click Save, and that'll create an API key reference. Now, what's a little confusing is you actually, once you initially create the API key, You also need to create a token for that key. So you'll see this sort of box for your API key, but you also need to click the plus token button. You just give the token a name. You can set an optional expiration, and then you'll want to copy the token to your clipboard. So if I go through this step here, for example, if I just call it test, and then if I create a token, I'll just call it test as well, generate token. You'll want to copy that to your clipboard and save it in a safe place. All right. Let me go ahead and just delete this test token. I'm working off a different one on my side. Okay, so save your Harness account ID, create and save your API token. Those are the initial steps that are Harness related. Going back to the other prerequisites, there are two additional third-party resources you need. We are going to use GitHub for reading and writing to source control, and we're going to use Docker as or Docker Hub specifically as our container registry. Both those resources are not strictly required to use Harness at all. They're just required in this workshop because that's what we'll be doing. And yeah, looking at the Q&A, looks like at least one person has successfully logged into Harness, so that's awesome. Yeah, I'll demo logging in as well using the API token too. So on the GitHub side, I'm not going to go through every single step of using of generating the GitHub token. The rough process is if you go to github.com and you go to your user profile. So if you don't have a GitHub account, you will need to sign up for one. There's a pretty straightforward on-screen presentation for how to do so. But once you're logged into GitHub under your user account, if you go to your user profile, settings, and then there's a section called developer settings, there's a drop-down called personal access tokens where you'd make your tokens of choice. It doesn't matter. You can use fine-grained or classic token. For ease of this workshop, I'm kind of going to show the classic route. If you create a new token, I already created one, but if you generate a new one, like a new classic token, oh, it's going to make me authenticate. Let me not bother with that. The lab shows you, but long story short, there are two scopes of permissions you need. You need repo read-write permissions, and then really important, you also need admin repo hook permissions. So if you look at these two permission checklists, you need to make sure that both of these are checked in the GitHub UI. The admin repo hook has to do with how we can interact with Harness as Harness reads and writes to GitHub source control, as well as how we trigger pipelines using Harness. Similarly to the Harness API, once you copy that GitHub token, save it in a safe place, we'll be using it so that Harness can communicate with GitHub. So Harness account and API token, GitHub account and personal access token. The third and final piece is a Docker Hub account and token. So on Docker Hub, we're going to use that as our container registry in this workshop. You can sign up on Docker Hub for free. You just go to hub.docker.com. If I go there, I already created my account. And you need an access token in Docker so that Harness can communicate with Docker Hub to read and write containers. You can create an access token in Docker Hub very similarly to the way you did in GitHub. If you click on your little user profile, it'll be under My Account. And then there's a section called Security. Again, I already have one created, but if you were to create a new access token, you'll give it a name. Make sure it has at minimum read and write permissions, because we are both going to pull containers from Docker, but we're also going to push containers to our Docker registry as well. So make sure it has at least read and write permissions. When you click generate, it'll give you a long string representing your token, very similarly to what you did in Harness and very similarly to what you did in GitHub. All right. I know there's a fair bit of prerequisite steps here. This is all just so these services can all communicate with each other. All right, let me go back to the PDF. So that is the Docker Hub setup. Okay, Kubernetes cluster. We provide this to you. So we are using a service called Instruct. I'm not sure the link has been posted in chat yet. If one of you, Dewan or Ravi, could post it in chat. It's also in the lab guide. Or actually, let's see, do we post it here?
No, because it's private.
Yeah, you're right. It's in the setup email. Or sorry, we'll paste it here in Zoom chat. I apologize. Dewan just did. So this is a shell. It'll look like a shell environment. And again, I'll demo this in just a moment. When you click that link that Dewan just posted in chat, it'll give you your own VM with a Kubernetes cluster to engage in all of these lab exercises. So what this will look like is if I go to here, the very first time you click that link, that should arrive you at a page that looks like this. It'll ask for just your first name, last name, email address. This is just for our resource tracking and our infrastructure. So if I put in my information and I hit submit and access, you should just see one piece of available content. It says Harness GitOps Lab. All you need to do is hit start. And this will take a moment. VMs are spinning up in the background. So this is just ephemeral temporary infrastructure that lives in the cloud. Every person gets their own VM cluster setup. So you're not going to be stepping on each other's toes. In a moment, we'll see a terminal shell that pulls up. So you'll just be accessing this in your browser, but you will be able to perform normal terminal commands against a Kubernetes cluster. So we'll wait just a moment. It normally takes maybe a minute or so, sometimes 2 minutes. And we should see a start button in the lower right corner here in just a moment. As usual, if you're running into any issues so far with infrastructure or setup, again, please let us know.
Yeah, someone brought up in the question area that unfortunately all three of us are alternate hosts. We're not hosts, so we can't turn certain things on. So two things we'll know for next time. One, we can't do breakout rooms, unfortunately. So let's put that out of the way. So if anybody has any trouble, we can just up you to like the speaker, so you can just like talk to us kind of like live. And then also we can't enable the chat, so sorry about that. But for the next time, we'll make sure one of us is like a legit host on Zoom webinar.
All right. Thanks, Ravi. So yeah, if you've been following along so far and you were able to get this kind of instruct setup up, you should now see a start button in the lower right-hand corner. And once you click start, that should arrive you into a shell that looks like this. I'm going to switch back. So I was showing this in incognito mode. I'm going to very quickly switch back to my other screen, and it should already have me logged into instruct. But let me just switch back over. Let me grab the link from chat and show you what it should look like. There's one or two more steps you'll want to do as part of, sorry, let me just, oh, it has to set up again. Okay, we'll give this one moment for me. Going back to the lab guide here for just a moment. I do want to make a quick note before I fully kind of show the instruct steps, is depending on how you signed up for this workshop, hopefully if you were able to make a Harness account, you should be okay. We have in our hosted CI builds some limitations on being able to use personal emails as account holders. Long story short, it has to do with protecting around like unauthorized usage of cloud infrastructure. So the ideal is you've used a work email of some kind to sign up for Harness. At that point, you shouldn't have any problems in your CI builds. If you have a Harness account with a personal email, you'll be able to do the CD part of this workshop. For CI, you'll run into issues with like cloud hosted builds. So we'll give you an alternate pre-baked image to use for the actual deployment. We're just going to use the canonical pod info image instead of the one we build from source. There's some more information here. I'll reference this again when we actually go through the CI pipeline build as a reminder, but just note because of some of our limitations around personal email signups, you might run into a snag with the CI build process. All right, back in instruct here, I went ahead and hit start. When we access the shell environment, a couple things you'll notice. This information on the right is largely a rehash of what I already talked about around the prerequisites. As a quick note, if you're having trouble with instruct, for whatever reason, might have firewall issues accessing the website, this script here on the bottom is something you can run locally on your laptop in order to create a local cluster using K3D. So you need access to a cluster, any cluster, to perform these workshop steps. We provide one for you. If you're following this lab guide, after the workshop or in the future, you would just need to set up a local cluster. Otherwise, you can go ahead and just hit this arrow to collapse this window and use this shell. Quick note, the default shell that comes up here is a very minimal just sh shell. If you try to use your arrow keys, for example, you're going to run into keyboard input problems. So what I recommend you do is just type bash in the shell prompt, hit enter, and now you're in a proper Bourne shell where you have history will work properly and arrow keys will work properly. So just type bash as your first command, and once you see this green Bourne shell input, you're good to go. All right. Back in the lab guide here, I went through most of step 2 already, virtual lab environment, getting into the Bourne shell. There's a few commands that are just used to test that everything is working. So as I mentioned before, we give you a Kubernetes cluster. So this terminal has the kubectl client installed. And if you run cluster info, it shows that you have a cluster available. Everyone gets their own little mini cluster. So again, we're not sharing Kubernetes cluster resources among attendees. We also have Git installed. We'll use Git once or twice as a client just to make the occasional code commit and to clone a reference repository. So that should be there. And then for interacting with Harness, we will do some things in the Harness UI. We will also use the Harness command line client. So if you run Harness V, I think is it. Yep. This shows that the CLI was pre-installed as well. So we'll be using the Harness command line quite a bit. Really important, this red bolded statement. Whenever we tell you to execute a terminal command, it'll always be an instruct in this virtual shell environment. So there's never going to be an expectation that you need to open up a terminal on your laptop and run anything locally there. It can all be done within this browser-based environment. Okay, so we can now go ahead and get started with our reference repository. So we have consolidated all of the files you need in this workshop into one big GitHub repo. It'll include the application source files for the application we'll be building in the CI stage. It'll include the configuration files that'll represent the Harness resources we're making. So most of the things you can make in Harness have underlying YAML configurations, and that's in this repo as well. And then our deployment manifest, so our Kubernetes and Argo resources that we're creating in this cluster we're giving you, those files are in here as well. So it's not, decoupled the way you might have it in real life, but just for sake of the ease of this workshop, we have everything in one big repository. The canonical source of this workshop repository is in a group in GitHub called Harness Community, in a repository called Harness GitOps Workshop. This repository is publicly viewable, but it's read-only for non-Harness people. So you can't push to this repository absent a pull request that Harness would need to approve. So what you want to do is, because you'll want to make changes to the repo that do things like trigger pipelines, you'll want to fork this repository into your GitHub account. So notice right now the group I'm in is Harness-Community. What you'll want to do is fork it, like I'm doing, into your personal GitHub user namespace. Mine's Nicholas Lotz. So if I click Create Fork in my GitHub account, giving this a moment here, now, and you'll want to double check this, now this is the repo fork that's in my GitHub user account. If you haven't done this fork action before in GitHub, think of it as a git clone, but within GitHub. You're cloning a repo from one namespace to another. This GitHub copy that you just made in your GitHub account is what you're going to clone into your virtual environment. So I'm going to do here, and if we look in the lab, so once you clone it into your personal GitHub namespace, you'll want to clone it into your instruct account. So if I go back to GitHub here, and I'm in my forked version, if I hit code, and then I copy the HTTPS clone link, if I go back to instruct here, I can clone it. Now, the instruction here, make note there's a placeholder. You'll want to replace this GitHub username placeholder with your actual GitHub username. So if I copy this, for example, and I paste it here, there's a line break there, so the line wrap shouldn't be an issue. you'll want to replace this GitHub username placeholder with your actual GitHub username. Mine's Nicholas Lotz. And there we go. It is cloned into instruct. We will spend a lot of time in this repo. There should now be a directory called harness GitOps workshop that we just cloned down. If I cd into it, and I get some real estate back here, there's several directories that we'll be using. So for example, we have a directory that contains our application source code. That's what we'll be building and containerizing and pushing to Docker Hub. We have a directory called CLI manifests that contains our harness entity YAMLs. So these contain our harness configurations. And we have some other directories we'll be using as well. So we'll spend a lot of time in this repo. So we cloned it, we CD'd in, and now we can use one of our tokens we created for the first time. As I mentioned before, we need to communicate with Harness using an API token if we're communicating with Harness on the command line. So hopefully you've made your Harness account. Hopefully you've copied your account ID if you're following along, an API token to a safe place. What we're going to do now is authenticate for the first time. All right, let me go ahead and copy this command. Anytime you see like an all caps underscore string, that means it's a placeholder. And I'll mention this, but just know that this is information you are meant to replace. So I'm sometimes get lost among my tabs. So I'm going to go ahead. It'll show, like, I'm going to paste in my token and account ID. I'm going to replace this token after this workshop. So don't worry that I'm showing my harness token here. Give me one moment to grab it and paste it in. So there's my harness token. I'm going to snag my harness account ID from my login URL. And if I enter this information correctly, it should show I'm successfully logged in. Don't worry about error reading credentials file. We're not using a credentials file. If you were able to authenticate, you should see this "it worked" message. You logged in successfully. If you were to run harness login without any information, it'll prompt for your username and API token as well. Really important point. And I'll say this again, this account ID is not your email or username. It is this auto-generated string that you can find here when you're logged into Harness. All right. Pretty quickly now that we've authenticated with Harness, we're going to create our first pipeline. It does require a couple of supporting steps. So remember when Dewan earlier talked about the idea of entities, he kind of showed a mermaid entity relationship diagram that shows like service and agent and application. The reason for that is Harness provides a framework that is meant to be reusable. So it requires a little bit of work on the front end to like create these connective entities between GitHub and Docker Hub, for example. But the idea is you make it and define it once, and then you can reuse these entities over and over again. So there's a little more pre-work we're going to do in Harness to set up our secrets, which is basically telling Harness what our GitHub and Docker Hub credentials are so it can connect to those. And then creating the actual communication pathways, which we call connectors. And then finally, we'll just do a YAML apply to make a pipeline that compiles our source code from GitHub and pushes the container image to Docker. But it does require a little bit of pre-work. Let's cd into this manifest directory. It's in the Harness GitOps workshop parent directory, which I'm already in. If I cd into that CLI manifests subdirectory, we find a bunch of files with YAML attached to them as an extension. These are all resources we're making in Harness. So if you make resources in Kubernetes, it's considered a best practice to create a declarative configuration in YAML. And when you apply that configuration, it creates or updates that resource. Harness is organized in a similar way, where you can certainly create the vast majority of Harness resources in the user interface graphically, but it also has underlying YAML definitions that you can create using the command line or API as well. This very first command we're going to run doesn't actually have we're not actually going to apply an underlying YAML representation. It's a very quick like secrets creation command. So if I look back in the lab guide here, I'm just going to run these two commands. Note these placeholders, GitHub pat and Docker Hub pat. This is going to create a secret in Harness representing your GitHub credentials and a secret in Harness representing your Docker Hub credentials. Just to be clear, GitHub pat and Docker secret, like you want these strings hard-coded as is. The name of the GitHub secret will be called literally GitHub_pat. The name of the Docker Hub secret will literally be called Docker_secret. And it's here where you'll actually substitute your access tokens respectively. So for example, in this one, if I go ahead and go to here and I paste it in, I'm going to leave GitHub pat alone there, but in this placeholder, I'm going to substitute my GitHub personal access token. Again, this is, I'll just delete this after the workshop's over. All right, so there's the GitHub secret. Looks like it worked for me. Harness said, I can't find a secret called that yet, so I'll create it, and it did. And then also, I'll do the same thing with my Docker secret. Now, these secrets are right now are just generic secrets in Harness. They're technically like not connected to GitHub or Docker yet. We'll do that here in just a moment. So again, there's my Docker Hub personal access token, which I will paste in here. Again, leave Docker secret alone as a literal string. Okay, so the command line like appeared to be okay. It seemed to work. We can verify that this worked in the Harness UI by going to a dedicated section. Okay, so back in the deployments module, let me exit out of this pop-up. There's a section under project setup called secrets. I do want to make a quick note. In this model, in this Harness UI, this is what my UI looks like. Harness is currently kind of A/B testing a slightly new navigation. The vast majority of lab steps will like be the same in both the new navigation and the old navigation. In the new navigation, if that's what you're seeing, I'm showing the old navigation. But if you see something slightly different, when you hit project setup, you'll likely see a collection of menu items here in the middle of your screen. You'll just need to click secrets from there. Otherwise, it's here on the left-hand side. There's a screenshot in the lab guide that shows an example of the new navigation. But if I click secrets here, I see that my Docker secret and my GitHub token were successfully created. All right. John, yeah, I see your question there in the Q&A. That is the message regarding personal emails. So yeah, that would mean that your whatever domain you use is not whitelisted in a category of non-personal emails that we have at Harness, unfortunately. So you do likely need to use a work email if you have one to sign up. I apologize about that. All right. Okay, so we have these secrets, and now we're going to use these secrets to actually connect to GitHub and Docker, respectively. Back in the lab guide. We're almost there. We'll create our pipeline in just a moment. We're going to create two resources called connectors. And you might be asking, like, why do I need to create these like separate authentication entities? It's for reusability. So the idea is we just create this kind of consolidated GitHub connection once, and then Harness can use it over and over again for different pipelines and resources it might need to create or read and write to GitHub for. These two commands require that you're in that CLI manifests directory. So if you're not already there in instruct, you'll want to cd into harness GitOps workshop /CLI-manifests. Once in there, there are two files that we'll use here in a moment. A file called GitHub connector.yaml and a file called Docker connector.yaml. We're going to run both of those just as is. First one, we can just copy and paste directly, is we're going to create the GitHub connector entity, and then we'll verify in the Harness UI. When you run this command, it will prompt for your GitHub username. And then under the hood, we have it baked in the YAML that it'll use the GitHub secret you just created as the access token. So my GitHub username, Nicholas Lotz, and it appeared to work. Again, we'll verify in a moment. We'll do the same thing, but with the Docker connector YAML, it's going to do the same thing, but with Docker Hub. Nicholas Lotz. And command line seems happy. Let me get some real estate back. Let's check in the UI. So our secrets, we're in that dedicated secret menu. Under project setup, there should be another menu option called connectors. And we see that these were just created a few seconds ago. If they were successfully connected to GitHub, we can see that, and Docker, respectfully, we should see this successful connection message. You can also click into it. You can click connection test to try again. You can also click the YAML representation, and we can see that it's referencing, this is my GitHub username and Harness Workshop repo that we're connected to, and then it's referencing the secret we created. If you see like a red error message saying that, it can't connect, double check your GitHub username, double check your secret you created. What's nice about these commands is it's a Kubernetes paradigm style apply. So you don't have to delete and recreate it. You can just update, make a change, re-enter your GitHub username, for example, and it'll update the entity accordingly. Right. Okay. We have one final little step when we create our first CI pipeline. We have a YAML representation for that. If you've used tools like Jenkins or GitLab or other CI/CD tools, you probably are familiar with the concept of like a mostly declarative configuration in JSON or YAML that shows your pipeline stages and steps and what those steps do, maybe define some variables. Similar idea here. So we have a YAML file that represents our build and push step for our application. If I go into that file, I'll use Vim to open it up. Vim CI pipeline.yaml. If you haven't used Vim before, there is a couple times in this workshop you do so I'll kind of show what commands to use. If you type Vim followed by the file name, it'll open it up in this Vim text editor. You want to scroll all the way to the bottom. There's one change you need to make. We'll look at the stages and what they do in the UI versus like parsing all of this YAML here in a moment. But if you scroll it through, you can see the different stages and steps. If you scroll down to the very bottom, either using the arrow keys or your scroller, there is one place here, 6 lines from the bottom, where there's a value of where we are sending our image, what repository or container registry. We have a placeholder there that says Docker username. It's near the bottom of the file. The one thing you need to change in this file is replace this placeholder with your actual Docker username. The way you do it is if you haven't entered insert mode yet, you just tap the I character, the I key on your keyboard, and you can see that enters you into insert mode. And then you can type as normal. So I can backspace and then type Nicholas Lotz, which is my my Docker Hub username. And then finally, to save and exit, this actually is the most asked question on Stack Overflow. How do I save and exit Vim? If you're already insert mode and you were like typing around, type the escape key to exit insert mode. This puts you into back of what's called command mode. And then on your keyboard, type : so shift : W for write, Q for quit, and that saves and exits. So : WQ. And that's how you save and exit out of Vim. I would recommend running a cat against the file to just verify that you made the change okay. Notice here, there's my substituted Docker Hub username. And then everything else should be left alone. And now we can create the pipeline. I have the command to do it right here. It's called harness pipeline and then apply against the CI pipeline YAML file. I'll just copy and paste that directly here. And once again, it seemed to have worked okay. Let me go to, we can verify it was done successfully in a couple ways. Let's go to Harness. And in the Harness UI, under Pipelines, we see a new entity was made. It's called CI/CD GitOps Pipeline. That was just hard-coded as the name of the resource in the YAML file. We haven't run it yet, so we don't see any recent executions. But if I click into it, we see a user interface graphical representation of what we made in the YAML file, or what was specified in the YAML file. we see there is one stage right now, just a CI stage, and each stage has one or more steps. If you actually click the CI stage tile, and then you click the execution tab, it shows you what's being done. This run OWASP test, by the way, is really a placeholder. It's very common. Yeah. So if you should see, yeah, successfully created pipeline with ID. I see, at least one person did so successfully. And this run OWASP test, by the way, because we're on the harness free plan in this workshops, we don't have right now, we're moving towards making this more available, but we don't currently have the full suite of security and testing orchestration tools. So right now we just have a placeholder for where you might run like some static or dynamic tests. Notice it's just an echo statement. In the future, when you add steps, you can either do it directly in the YAML, but there's also graphical routes where you can, if I type OWASP or I look at all the security tests, these are some of the different things you can add. Actually, it looks like they might be available now. But for right now, we're just keeping it as a placeholder. The real meat of this pipeline will be the build and push. This is going to use Harness's hosted CI environment. So this isn't going to do this locally on your laptop. Harness will spin up an environment that will clone your GitHub fork. It'll compile the source code in the apps directory, and then it'll Dockerize it, and then push it to your Docker registry on Docker Hub. It'll do all that in this pipeline. The app we're actually building is an app called Pod Info. This is considered kind of like a canonical Hello World microservice that you can deploy in Kubernetes. All it really does is it just shows you, like, the only thing the app does is it shows you where the app is deployed, like what's its networking information. But it is something cool you can set a replica count for and those sorts of Kubernetes things. All right, I've talked enough here. Let's run this thing. In the top right, hit the run button. Leave everything alone. This is just saying that we're going to pull from and build off of the main branch in our repository. And then moment of truth, hit run. And we're off to the races. We can just sit back for a moment and monitor the progress. There is a log down here at the bottom where you can also expand it out or move it around a little bit. You can make it even full screen if you want to. I'll get out of here, where you can see the actual steps that are being executed. In a moment, after the clone is complete, you'll actually see the different like Docker build or Docker login, Docker build, Docker push steps. But we see right now, pulling it down. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Again, as simple as that, you actually have a distributed build. Now, understood that some folks like a little bit of a contention with the email you signed up with versus like if it's on a whitelist from us versus if you're using like some folks on here are using like your company account, right, which is already whitelisted. So but yeah, as simple as that with Harness, you can have a distributed build system and push out a Docker image or of something you just built. Pretty straightforward. Where we're going to do a little bit more complicated things now, I'm going to steal some of Nick's thunder here, is we're going to actually take this and deploy into more than one environment in a GitOps-based model. And so that's like more realistic. Like that's pretty realistic if you're a platform engineer or DevOps engineer saying, okay, we're able to like by convention build, but leveraging, let's say, this new GitOps paradigm, how do we go about and all of us have more than one environment, right? Like it's one thing to deploy to like your local cluster, but another thing is like if we have 2 or 3 different environments, which will kind of fake my namespace here. How do you get your changes out into multiple environments? And that is the part I'm very excited about in this workshop. It's I know I haven't done it by hand in Argo before. It was fairly difficult for me to do that using application sets and like this app of app model. But here we'll make it pretty straightforward. So didn't want to steal too much of your thunder. Just saying, hey, some cool stuff is coming up, in the lab.
And the reason is so we're going to look at it. It looks like it's completed. So let me quickly check Docker Hub, and then we'll take a short break here in a moment to give folks a chance to get up and stretch for a few minutes. But it looks like everything completed. We can kind of verify that here by looking at the log. These are just the commands and command output that Harness is running in its build environment. But if I go to Docker Hub and I go back to my homepage here, the repository I pushed to is this Harness GitOps workshop repository. We can actually see that it was just changed a minute ago. And then we see that the latest push was a minute ago. Okay, quick explanation. In this initial CI build, we're using the tag latest. we're going to change this in CD. So when we actually add our CD extensions, we're actually going to modify it. So we're giving the Docker image a tag, something more meaningful and a little more best practice. We fully know that like latest is not a good default tag. You just want to hard code onto your image. It's just for the sake of this first pipeline, it's just kind of a placeholder for now. It'll be changed automatically when we update the manifest a little bit later today. Okay, so long story short, everything we've done so far is we have gotten through the CI step, kind of the initial chunk of connecting the harness and getting an image built and pushed. We are now about 55 minutes into the workshop, so I think we are due for a short 10 or so minute break. If anyone has any questions in the meantime, you're more than welcome to use the Q&A portion. If you were trying to follow along in the lab and you're behind or you need to catch up, please don't let us stop you. At least one of us will kind of be present during the break. We'll rotate in and out just to make sure that there's always someone available if anyone has any questions. But that said, any final thoughts from participants or harness folks so far before we take a quick 10?
This is good. And yeah, like if you if you don't mind, if you want to also just like talk, we can upgrade you to a panelist so you can come off of mute and we can look at your screen and whatnot. And so I know, sorry, like we're co-hosts, not hosts. I didn't realize there was like a nuance in Zoom between us, what we can do with a webinar. But yeah, we could take.
Yeah, there's a raise hand button on the chat. So if you raise your hand, we can make you a panelist, and then you can ask questions or discuss. Nick, I think we'll be here, so feel free to grab a bite, get refreshed. We'll be here.
All right, everybody, welcome back. It's close to 10 past the hour here at least here in the US, if you're in that type of time zone. Welcome back, everyone. We are about to be off to the races to continue this workshop. Once again, I am demoing all of the steps in this lab guide here. We just finished on page 13 of the PDF, the CI pipeline build step. So we have finished the CI piece of this lab. Actually, sorry, page 14. And in page 15, it's just a screenshot. And we're about to start on page 16, which begins our CD steps. So if you have been following along, what you should have so far is a successful run, hopefully, of your CI pipeline. The result is a published container image to Docker Hub, which right now is just tagged as latest. That's not a best practice. We'll change that in these later steps. We're now going to move to advanced CD, and this is where things get what I might call non-trivial, but extremely powerful. Remember, in the initial discussion at the beginning of this workshop, that Dewan talked about the concept of GitOps. And the idea is that rather than an imperative sequence of linear steps executed by either a human or a computer, the idea of GitOps is I say what I want and the computer makes it happen, right? Understand that nuance. So this pipeline we've made so far, CI, is largely imperative, right? You're running a linear sequence of steps, which is with CI, kind of unavoidable in the sense that, how compilers and build systems work. They run steps to convert your application to some kind of binary or image format. In the case of GitOps, though, when we're adopting this Kubernetes declarative cloud-native model, we use YAML-based manifests to say, make my deployments look like this. And then we rely on tools to make that happen versus us, tweaking and turning the wrench ourselves. The tool that we are going to be used under the hood is Argo CD. Harness supports a couple of declarative GitOps style tools, namely Argo and Flux. We're going to be using Argo. Just know Flux is supported as well. They're open source tools that Harness leverages under the hood for a lot of its processes. So what we have so far is the CI pipeline. And then in the course of this next part of the workshop, we're going to end up building upon this pipeline in a way that allows us to preserve a GitOps way of deployment, even through having a pipeline. And we'll kind of show how that needle is threaded here in the process. So if I go back to the lab guide, this step 4 is going to be deploy GitOps application. What it'll involve here is we're going to create a few other resources in Harness that represent the scaffolding for how we can take our source code repo, which already happens to have deploy manifests in it, and then create what we call a GitOps application that is then pulled into our Kubernetes cluster. The pull-based approach is really important here. The idea is, and for GitOps reasons, for networking reasons, we don't want to try and like push our changes into an environment. First of all, often you can't, right? Most, at least enterprises, have firewalls where you can't just like have random ingress into it. However, it's a lot easier to reach outside your environment if you're already inside. So changes are going to be pulled from our repository whenever there's an update to update our cluster and our deployments accordingly. How do those pull-based changes happen? It requires us to install something in our cluster that can communicate to Harness. So if you've used, again, other CI/CD tools before, very often you might install some kind of agent in or near whatever environments you want to deploy to. There's other ways, you might be doing SSH deployments that are more pushed-based, but a lot of modern CD tools require some sort of agent install, and Harness has that as well. We are going to install a resource called a GitOps agent into our virtual environment. It'll just be installed through a YAML manifest. And then that resource in our environment, that's what will initiate the communication with Harness. So the agent will be responsible for checking whether there's any changes it needs to deploy, and then deploying those changes into your cluster. So we're going to start off in the Harness UI. So the first step here involves the UI. I'm going to navigate to Harness. Again, I'm on step 6, or on page 16 of the lab guide. And I'm going to go over back to deployments here. And there's a section here at the bottom menu under the deployments module that says GitOps. And this is where we can create those needed resources to perform GitOps tasks. Some of these resources we can see here in the left: cluster, repository, applications. We'll deal with those in a moment. But if you go to the top right of this UI under settings, there's a section that says GitOps agents. There's a section that says GitOps agents. And we'll click on that. This is going to be that supporting resource we'll install in our cluster. I'm sorry, I forgot to delete this one. This is a previous deployment I had. You should see a blank screen that looks like this. There are no GitOps agents yet if you're in a fresh Harness account. We're going to click the button that says New GitOps Agent, and there'll be a little kind of UI workflow decision tree that we'll go through for a couple steps. The first is you can deploy an agent if you have no Argo set up yet, or if you have an existing Argo instance. Harness supports both of those setup styles. We're starting from a blank slate here. We don't have anything Argo or Lux related in our virtual environments that we've provided. So under this first question, I'm going to hit no Argo yet. And what'll end up happening is alongside the agent deployment, we'll also be installing needed Argo supporting resources as well. Argo is an open source project, again, that Harness heavily leverages, but we're effectively installing an Argo instance that our agent will use in our cluster. So hit no, and then hit start. And then this overview screen, there's just two things we need to enter here. One is a name for the agent. You can actually put what you want here. We don't have to be prescriptive about this one. I'm going to be very kind of standardized and simple and put GitOps agent as the name of my agent, just one big string there. And then the second is, what namespace in our cluster are we going to deploy to? For this workshop, we're going to keep it simple. I'm going to say my default namespace will be sort of my administrative namespace where I'll deploy my agent. It might not be what you actually do. What we're actually going to model in this workshop is, rather than like a multi-cluster environment, we're actually going to have different namespaces represent different deployment environments for the sake of this workshop. So we'll have like a dev namespace and a prod namespace just to kind of show a separation of concerns. So the only two things you need to change here are entering a name, doesn't matter what, I'll put GitOps agent, and then you do need to put default for the namespace. We're going to keep the GitOps operator as Argo. Note that this is where you can choose between Argo and Flux as the supporting GitOps tool as well. And then if you need it, over here on the right, this gives more information about exactly what's installed, and then the relevant cluster permissions that might be needed. If you have a security team that needs to whitelist any of these kinds of changes, this is the sort of information you'll give them. All right, so again, name, configuration, continue. sorry, name and namespace, and then continue. Okay, there's a couple methods in which you can install the agent. There is a Helm installer. There's also a YAML manifest we can apply directly. There is a slight piece of friction in this step because it is non-trivial to upload files into our browser-based virtual environment and instruct. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to click on YAML here. And again, the lab guide goes through this as well. So where I am in the lab is right here, install agent and cluster. I'm sorry, right here in step 7 and 8 on page 18. You'll hit YAML, and then it actually shows you the raw YAML manifest. Now this is hundreds of lines long, so don't try to read this, and also don't try to edit it. But it shows you the entire thing here. The relevant button you want to click is this copy button. This will copy the entirety of this manifest. So copy this to your clipboard, just hit the copy button. And then back in the instruct environment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create a new file called gitops-agent.yaml, like so. So step 18 under install agent, step 1, or page 18 under install agent. I'm going to run vim just to have my source directory be my home directory, gitops-agent.yaml. And this will open it up in Vim. And then from here directly, you can just right-click, paste, and it's going to do this kind of annoying, rapid-fire paste of all the text. It should all be formatted okay. It will take a minute. There's a lot that it's pasting. But if you hit that copy button from Harness and then just right-click paste here, the formatting should be preserved. And it should end here for me in just a moment.
Very, very psychedelic. I had to watch that.
I know.
We do have an enhancement coming out, so you can get this. So we barely missed a workshop. It was they were working on it right now, and so it's one of those two things that we were trying to get for everybody. But yeah, just bear with us on the copy and paste. Thanks.
Okay. If it was all pasted successfully, your final lines should look like this under the final resource specification that was made. There's around looks like 22,000-ish lines of text. There's a lot. I'm going to colon WQ out of here to save the file. Again, don't edit the file. I now have this gitops-agent.yaml in my home directory. And then finally, back here, this is just a simple apply command, but it does give you the command to copy. Importantly, this is the command file we're applying. We're applying it to our default namespace. If I just copy and paste, it'll create the needed resources. Notice there's a lot of Argo resources and config maps and network policies being made. We can observe what's being created in a couple of different ways. First of all, once you hit apply back here in Harness, if you click continue, as the resources are made in your cluster, they'll start to check in with Harness. And after about a minute or so, you'll start to see some green checks showing up saying things are checking in okay. If I run kubectl git pods, for example, it'll show you some of the pods that have been spun up. I think the lab has you do something similar. Yeah, you can run git deployments as well. Yep. And we can see the agent as well as the supporting Argo resources also. And we can see that after about a minute or two, depending on, networking kinks, you should see green checks showing that everything checked in okay. Again, what's important here is that the agent is always the one initiating communication with Harness. So the call is coming from inside the house. The network traffic's going from your cluster to Harness, and the agent is checking in every few seconds. Okay, so GitOps supporting resource number 1 is we have an agent installed that can perform GitOps tasks. The second item we need to do before we can deploy is we need to create 2 resources that represent our deployment infrastructure and our source repository, respectively. So if I go back to the settings here in GitOps, I see repositories and clusters here. If I go back to overview, I also see repositories and clusters and that we don't have any. So we're going to create both of these. It's worth noting that this cluster resource is not literally creating a Kubernetes cluster. We have one. We're just representing it as a target deployment infrastructure in Harness. Likewise, this repository is not going to, git init a new repository. It's just going to tell Harness that the forked repository we already have is where we're deploying from, is where our deployment manifests live, rather. So looking at where we are in the lab guide, we have the agent deployed. We're going to need to use the agent to reference the resources we make. So when we set up our cluster, for example, Harness is going to rely on the agent details to effectively interpret what the cluster is and where we're deploying to. So as just kind of syntactic sugar here, I'm going to go ahead and just create page 19, step 8, create an environment variable and instruct, and just have that reference my agent for the next commands I'm going to run. Over here in Harness, if you go to your GitOps agent under settings, there's a little ID shown here. If I click into it, there's another identifier shown here. If I just copy the agent ID to my clipboard, I'm now just going to create an environment variable here that I'll call agent name equals GitOps agent, checking my work all in one go. And now I'll be referencing this variable when I'm creating existing other resources that are GitOps related. All right. Next is we are going to create a GitOps cluster. Again, we're not spinning up a new Kubernetes cluster. We're just telling Harness where our cluster is. It's going to be pretty simple. It's just going to use the agent details. So I'm going to make sure that I'm in that CLI manifests directory within that Harness GitOps workshop parent directory. And then I will literally just apply a YAML that I have here called GitOps cluster.yaml. If you were to cat this YAML, it's pretty minimal, right? The reason is because it's going to rely on the agent as the source of all the cluster information. So if I go ahead and now run, and again, there's a line break here, so this is actually all one line technically, or all one command. If I run this command, it said, okay, we don't have a cluster reference in Harness yet. We're going to create one. It's called GitOps cluster. That's just hard-coded in this YAML file, the name that I chose to give it. So now if I go to GitOps, I now see there's a cluster entity, and it's relying on the GitOps agent for communication. We see the connection is successful, right? We're able to connect to it, and we'll ultimately be able to deploy to it. Next step is we're going to run a couple Kubernetes related commands that are going to kind of model our cluster as our deployment infrastructure. So very often in enterprise deployments, you'll end up having a full network separation. So you'll have maybe a dev cluster and a staging cluster and a prod cluster. In our case, we're using this kind of workshop sandbox environment. So rather than have multiple clusters, we're going to create two namespaces, and we'll call that namespace separation our different deployment environments. So I'm just going to run a command that creates two namespaces in my existing cluster that I'm calling dev and prod, just for this workshop. And there they are. Back in the lab guide. Okay, next step is create an entity called a repository. We're not creating a new Git repo from scratch. We're pointing Harness to our existing Git repo. But wait, you might ask, we already made those GitHub connectors. What about those? Those GitHub connectors are more for authentication. So that's to authenticate with a Git service. In this case, GitHub. This repository is going to be our manifest root, or our deployment source. So this is more of this is the what. Where are we deploying from versus authentication. So if I go to settings, repositories, this is where a new repository will show up. If I go into my CLI manifests directory here, we see there's yet again another YAML called GitOps repo.yaml. And if I cat that, we can see this is actually where we have that placeholder. So again, this is saying, where do my deployment manifests live? So this we can't just directly apply. We do need to change this GitHub username placeholder. Couple ways you can do it. The example on the lab guide actually has you use sed. You could as easily open this up in Vim and just replace GitHub underscore username with your actual like GitHub username. So this will be your forked GitHub repo you're referencing. If I copy from the lab guide, the example here is just this command. And if you haven't used sed before, it can look a little wonky, but it's just a find and replace. So what I'm doing is I'm replacing the GitHub username placeholder, like that string, wherever I find GitHub underscore username with my actual GitHub username. And there's an example there in the lab guide where if your name was like John Smith, that's what the structure would look like. In this case, my GitHub username is Nicholas Lotz. So I'll just run it like so.
That's a very clean sed command. And I've seen some sed commands that are like hundreds of lines long. People have to find replace like in some of these YAML manifests. And it's like, I'm like, oh, I have the power of sed plus 1%. So.
Again, I'm a Unix guy, so I'm dealing with like, text streams historically day in and day out, and it can get complicated. If you run sed or if you just do a find and replace in Vim, again, this is showing your proper fork URL. And then you can now, back in the lab guide, apply the command to create the repo. Again, I have like a Unix line break here, so you can just copy this whole thing from the PDF, paste it, just double checking my work. And again, the way these are made is Harness looks, do we already have the repo referenced? Nope, I'll create it. And there it is. Back in Harness, we see a repository reference here. If I click into it, I now see I have my GitOps repo. This is the repository I'll be deploying from. We're able to talk to it. Give me a moment here. Okay. We're about to finally deploy our application. So far we have built PodInfo. We have not deployed anything yet. We're going to do that now. Remember when I said that when you install the agent, Harness installs some supporting Argo tooling. Harness creates a fresh Argo project that's like represents your Argo instance that got installed in your cluster, and it maps to your Harness project when you install the agent. You actually need to reference that Argo project in your deployment manifest in like one place. And it allows us to create this like multi-environment deployment that we can then promote between. When you install your agent in Harness under the agent section, if I click into my GitOps agent, we can actually see it mapped here as well. There's a section that says mapped Harness project. What's your Argo project? What's your equivalent Harness project? So we see for my Harness project, the equivalent Argo project is this like string that starts with 57 in my case. It would look different for you. So we'll go ahead and copy this. I'll copy this project string. And then the version of the deployment manifest that needs to be updated is the deployment manifest that lives in your GitHub fork. So remember, you cloned the repo into like the instruct virtual shell environment, but that's just so you have access to the Harness YAMLs when you're running the Harness CLI commands. The actual source of what we're building and deploying lives in your GitHub fork. So if I go to my GitHub fork, which is back here, again, your forked version of the workshop repo, there is a directory called configs git generator files discovery. And this contains our deployment manifests. This is a special type of file that is creating custom resources, and it represents an application step. The kind of 5-word summary of this is it's deploying to multiple environments using one Argo instance. So if I click git generator files.yaml, notice this is an Argo defined resource. It represents what's called an application set. And there's a couple placeholders we'll need to change here. And again, I'm looking at page 22 of the lab. So we're going to make one commit to our GitHub copy of the forked repository, our GitHub fork of the repo. And it's going to change just a couple lines in this manifest. I'm going to go ahead and just edit it directly in GitHub. You can just hit the pencil button It's this kind of git generator files.yaml file. On line 16, this is a placeholder for your Argo project ID. I'm going to paste that in. And then you also see 2 references to your GitHub username as well. That needs to be changed as well. I know it feels like we've been like addressing that GitHub username placeholder in a lot of places. There's just several areas where it needs to be set. So lines 8, 16, and 18. I'm going to just commit directly to main. It's not going to trigger anything yet because I haven't actually like created the GitOps sync behavior, but it'll just update this copy. I'm not going to bother with any fancy commit message. I'm going to just commit directly to my main branch, and this file is updated in my fork. One other thing I want to point out is there's a little bit of like variable magic we do here as well in this file. Notice these brackets that say cluster.namespace. Well, remember a moment ago I made those dev and prod namespaces. This is representing kind of an expression of our deployment environments. In fact, in a separate directory, there are configuration directories for dev and prod. And those are my namespaces as well. So we kind of have this mapping here where our environments in this kind of contrived workshop are represented by these namespaces I've made. All right. We'll have a deployment here in just a moment. So finally, page 23, I'm going to make what's called the application set. So there's one more GitOps manifest that I can find and instruct. It's called GitOps app.yaml. And this contains the information I'll need to deploy. It'll actually prompt for my GitHub username, so we won't need to change anything here. But this is the relevant YAML file. And then, making sure I'm in the right directory, which I am, I'm going to just apply the file. Step 2, page 23. It will prompt for your GitHub username yet again. And it'll create the GitOps app. Where this lives in Harness is right here under Applications. If I go to Applications, I see GitOps application. I see a red out of sync indicator. So the application reference was successfully made, but it's out of sync. We have not actually initiated a sync yet. There's several ways a synchronization can be initiated. And just to remind you, what this is doing is, because it's GitOps, it tells the agent to check, it tells Harness to check your referenced GitOps repo, our Git repo, our GitOps fork, to see if anything's changed since the last sync. Because again, this is a pull-based approach. We have not done any initial sync yet, so nothing's been deployed yet. There are many ways you can sync the application. There are ways you can do it automatically. We're going to do a manual sync, like we're going to press a button here in a moment. You can also have a synchronization as part of a pipeline, where if you run a pipeline, there can be a step that performs like a resync of your deployment based off, whatever change has been made in the Git repo. If I click into the application, notice nothing's been made yet, except just a reference to the application, which is really the Harness reference. But now, if I hit the sync button in the top right corner, I'll now just click synchronize. Notice it's syncing off the main branch of my repo. And now I'll see a little bit more information. In a single environment application, you'll actually see the Kubernetes resources directly here. Because we have an application set, we're deploying to multiple environments, and we see kind of child application references that represent the actual Kubernetes resources in each environment. So in this initial GitOps application window, we actually see the dev and prod children of our actual 2 deployments to 2 environments. But now if I actually go back to my main GitOps page and I go to applications, here is where I see the relevant differences. And again, because we're doing a manual sync right now, these do need to be like manually kicked off. So this initial sync said, hey, I have an app set of 2 environments, dev and prod. And then these environments, are actually separately synced with any changes from the Git repo. So I'm going to hit sync for dev.
one of the as Nick is doing that, like another, harness certainly has the capability of having like multiple triggers, as Nick was mentioning. So typically for a GitOps pipeline would be like an SCM event, like a commit or a push or a PR type of event that you want to filter down on before executing these. Also, I don't think we get to it in this workshop, but Harness has like very sophisticated triggers. Like you can have Harness monitor like Docker registries. So like, oh, in the presence of a new artifact, for example, that if tightly coupling that CI stage that we have, saying that, hey, this is me getting on my soapbox now. Like I'll take 20 seconds for it. So usually, there's like two sides of the equation, right? There's like when building a GitOps workflow, usually you're hyper focused on like a Kubernetes manifest, but like you need something to deploy, right? Like there's that cart versus the horse analogy there. So here, we can actually have harness monitor like, hey, for that artifact that was pushed to your Docker Hub registry here, we can monitor it for when to kick off a certain build. So I didn't want to steal too much of your thunder, Nick, but it's very, very possible in Harness to kind of wire this up for like your enterprise like that if swapping out the example here.
I'll be adding a few comments as well. So you might wonder that why we're creating applications, GitOps application using application set, right? You could just use regular Argo CD definition and create, I don't know, 3 or 10 different applications. But that gets really difficult to manage. So imagine you never create pods by hand, right? Like create 10 pods that you deploy. Typically, what you do is you create deployments and then you define how many replicas, how many numbers of pods. So the deployment creates the pods. So delete the deployment, all the pods goes away. So similar concept is shown using application set. So when Nick created this application set creates 2 child Argo CD applications, one for the dev namespace, one for the prod namespace. And this is sort of how you scale and manage applications in enterprise. Sorry, Nick, took 2 minutes.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for all that context. And yeah, there's a question. Sorry, I'm not sure if you got to the Q&A. There's a great question here. Can you also manage ingress and deployment resources from Harness, like promoting the Kubernetes cluster, or is it only to manage application sets from Harness? So
Yes.
yeah, you
Go
came
ahead.
along with that? No, go
Yeah,
ahead.
you like because like those deployment resources are like manifest. Like I'll just harp on like one like, oh, ingress resources, right? Like, yes, like harness you're managing you can manage any Kubernetes resource as part of the deployment. Whereas using an application set to represent more than one cluster. So like we're using that we are relying on the application set model, the Argo, like it's an Argo construct, right? Like to say that, hey, if you have more than one environment, more than one, usually it's cluster depending on the generator you use, to deploy. But it could be any manifest. It can be a CRD, it can be an operator, it can be a Ravi resource. I'm making that resource up, but like it can be anything. So I don't don't want to get anything out of subtract, but it's any Kubernetes resource.
Depending on your how customized your environment is, like Harness meets that. Like, it has all of these pre-baked pipeline steps that you can like set up. Some teams ultimately, when they first get started, they're like, we have been operating on like chain together bash scripts for years. And sometimes that's how you get started. So you can even like, if you really need to, you can chain together shell scripts. It is absolutely not a GitOps way of doing things. But like Ravi said, there's a progressive way that you can like rely on the Harness opinionated way of some stuff, or just, anything you might have to have hacked together, you can, upload into Harness as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and one last comment on the best practice, right? So what we're showing in this workshop is one way of doing things. This is not the only way of doing things. For example, the Harness GitOps workshop that Nick is using here has both the application source code and the configuration in the same repository. That's used mostly in the industry, but there's also practice where you have a separate application source code repository and a separate configuration repository. So certainly what we're showing here in this workshop is one way of doing things.
Absolutely. So it's worth noting, and if you were kind of following along as I was showing this UI, like these look like Kubernetes. These are Kubernetes terms, right? Service, deployment, endpoints, replica set, pod. Like we just deployed things. So if we go into instruct, this shows everything that was deployed: a service, a deployment. Instruct kind of makes it difficult. We didn't actually expose the service port. So like if you were running this locally, you could port forward the service and actually look at the app in a web browser. It's just this, as I mentioned before, this pod info application. If we actually look at it here, let me go to the code. This is actually what it would look like if you were to deploy it. It's just this, little tiny web endpoint that pops up, showing, where it's checking in from. But again, the main goal of this was to really showcase the Kubernetes, at least so far, is to showcase the Kubernetes resources that you can deploy. You can manually verify that here. You can also look in the resource view and see it also. Okay, so from a GitOps perspective, like this is pretty straightforward, or it's pretty GitOpsy, right? It's a very declarative way of syncing from a deployment manifest. Where things can get a little complicated, especially with multiple environments, is managing updates. And that's what we'll actually be doing in the next section. Actually, Ravi and Dewan, quick time check. Should we proceed forward into that, you think? Should we take another break?
Might take like a 2-minute break, and so let folks kind of
Yeah,
yes.
let's do this. Let's make it maybe round it out to 5.
Okay, sure.
A quick 5 for a bio break, coffee break, whatever you might need. And then what we're going to do is we're going to finally put it all together and take all the GitOps stuff I did and extend it as part of a pipeline to manage like end-to-end updates while maintaining kind of the integrity of our GitOps approach.
All right, time for one more layer of GitOps magic, putting it all together. So I'm really
This
excited.
timer reminds me of my university exams. In the exam halls, the prof put this big timer, and every time I see this timer, it gives me stress.
I was about to say, yeah, I think I have some unresolved trauma there as well from
Same here. Same here.
from physics 101 exams or whatever the weed out classes were when I was in college. All right, everyone. Okay, so let me explain the motivation of this last section here. So we're basically consolidating everything in one pipeline. Right now, we've had the imperative CI build, right? So don't forget, we still have that CI build and push to Docker. And then we set up this like GitOps thing that wasn't a pipeline, right? All those GitOps entities we made, like that's not a pipeline. Those are kind of harness resources that like pull from changes to a Git repo, but it's not a pipeline the way I have it set up here. So one question that basically teams come up with is how do we reconcile this ideal GitOps paradigm of say what you want and like this pull-based update approach with change management, right? Because when you think of change management in an organization setting, automated often through pipelines and checks and approvals, like that's imperative. That's a run book. It's like follow this sequence of steps. So when you need to make environment changes, which might be under some change management system with all these approval and security teams, but you have the configuration stored in GitOps, how do we manage these changes in a way that preserves your Git repo as a source of truth? What we want to avoid is drift. We want to avoid people tinkering with the environments in real time that aren't captured in our Git repository. Otherwise, you're synchronizing a Git repository that doesn't fully reflect what your environment looks like. One of the ways that Harness achieves this and solves this problem is through what's called a PR pipeline. PR meaning pull request. Really what it is it's steps you can expand your pipeline into that whenever something requires an environment configuration change that you're trying to represent using GitOps, using Git, Harness can kind of perform the automated Git update steps where you can use Harness as the pane of glass for builds, for pushes, for approvals, for role-based access control. Your platform engineers won't have to leave Harness. But when you're making changes to your operational environment, you can have Harness be the entity that actually modifies your Git repo. So you're not deviating from how your developers are used to working or how the GitOps paradigm says things should be done by having everything ultimately be sourced in a Git repo. So that's the big philosophy. There's a lot to this, and we won't, there might be some unanswered questions once I'm done with this final demo. So please don't be afraid to ask at any point. But let's go through this kind of put everything together and run this end-to-end pipeline setup. Okay, right now in Harness, we created a CI pipeline that runs Harness's hosted builds. So it used like a Harness temporary environment to build the application. And then we offer this Kubernetes cluster and instruct that's used for deployments. So far, we installed this agent pod in this namespace. And that agent is used to run GitOps tasks. Right now, Harness actually has like two separate agent-like things for two different areas. The GitOps agent is used for GitOps related updates. And then another agent-like entity called a delegate is used specifically for pipeline execution. Harness is always looking to like simplify and make things a little bit more, as I said, simplified. But at least for right now, there are two separate things you need to install in your cluster for GitOps, which we've done, and then something separate for pipelines called a delegate. If you're using like exclusively pipelines and not GitOps at all, the delegate would be what you actually install that performs all of the pipeline related deployments. Long story short, we just need to add the delegate so we can have the pipeline make environment updates in our environment alongside the GitOps agent. So it is an additional resource you need to install in your cluster for the purpose of this example. So what that means is we're going to run just a Helm command on our cluster that installs the GitOps, that installs the delegate. Sorry. When you made your project in Harness, it should have created a token that can be used for a delegate automatically. If I go to project setup and I go down to delegates, and there's a section, we don't have any delegates yet. Think of a delegate as just another type of agent, just for pipelines. If I go to tokens, there should be a default token already there, and you can go ahead and copy its value. So now what the lab guide has us do is it just has us set two environment variables that will then pass into a long Helm command that we can just copy and paste. Sorry, there's a little bit of yard work being done right outside. If you hear it, it should be gone here in just a moment, but I'll power through. So back here, I'm going to copy this environment variable. And then I'm going to copy my delegate token from project setup, delegates, tokens. And that's value number 1. And then it's also going to use my Harness account ID, so it knows where the delegate lives in Harness. So back here, and then I'll copy my Harness account ID from my URL where it should be. Good. Okay. And now this long Helm command. This actually runs 3 commands. It adds the Helm repository, then runs an update on it, and then it actually installs the delegate. With all these backslashes here, you can just copy this whole thing, and the correct line wrapping should be preserved. And then if I copy all that to my clipboard and just paste it all here and hit enter, this means it worked. or it should have worked. So it added the repo and then installed the delegate in my cluster. Now, when you install the delegate, it goes in its own namespace. So if I run kubectl git ns, there's actually a new namespace that was just made called harness delegate ng. And if I look there should be a new pod spinning up. It should check in here in just a moment. It will check into Harness automatically. So notice I wasn't like going in the Harness UI to make the delegate other than copying the token. If I go to Harness and I go to delegates, we see that actually it just checked in. And don't worry about detecting. That's just upgrade related stuff. As long as it says connected, it checked in. So now we can run a pipeline that makes changes to my infrastructure in Kubernetes in this case. All right. We are on the home stretch here. So we made the delegate. When it comes to pipelines, Harness uses abstractions called environments and services to represent where I'm deploying and what I'm deploying, respectively. Yeah, it says my delegate is running, but not showing in Harness. What I would suggest is try refreshing the page a couple times, seeing if it shows up. Check that you copy the delegate token. And yeah, we can assist here if you're still running into problems.
You can get you can kubectl get pods take a and instruct, and then you can do like kubectl get log and the pod name. You can see if it's connected, so it you can see, or like Nick said, hit refresh if it's running. Yeah, you say like your delegate's running, it might be.
Yeah.
Refresh.
One of us can jump in if you're still running into problems. So I'll go ahead and move on here. These next commands you can just run directly. Oh, you're saying it's not running. Okay, you might want to check the way you copied and pasted those commands and wait a moment for it to check in. Yeah, it might take a couple minutes. Trying to start for 9 minutes. Okay. Yeah, I think one of us can jump in and help if you're able.
No, the one. Why do you spin up a separate Zoom? This is our breakout list here, so not sure who the attendee is. Anonymous attendee.
Yeah, I can spin up a separate Zoom and then share the link.
Yeah, that'll be perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for bearing with us. And again, this lab guide, it's also, you'll have access to this after this workshop as well. But for the sake of time, let me go ahead and move forward. These next abstractions, I'm just going to just run and create. And we'll see what's made in Harness. These are how the pipeline is going to reference environments and services. An environment represents my target deployment. Remember, we have dev and prod as separate namespaces, which will serve as environments. And then the service will be our actual release deployments, our release files that we're applying. So let me just copy this to my clipboard. I'm just going to paste it directly here. And we can see 2 environments were created. If I go into Harness and I go to Project, Environments, here are the references. And again, this is going to control our environment. This represents our environment configurations that we'll be updating. And this is being recorded, so we will have the recording available as well. Yeah. And then also so we have our environments. Sorry, getting back here. And then the service, if I cat that in the virtual environment here, notice this is referencing the config files in our Git repo. And notice a placeholder here that says env.name. That's a Harness variable that represents which environments we're deploying to, which we also have set up as configuration directories in proper GitOps fashion. So there's a lot of variable syntax here to dynamically, designate the where and what of our deployments. Oops, sorry, I copied that by mistake. All right. All right, the service is made. If I go to services, I have the service made called pod info service. And then if I go to the configuration, we actually put in the service YAML the location of our deployment manifests, where in the Git repo they'd live. All right. Okay, last step or 2 before we can deploy. We need to link our environments we made with our GitOps cluster infrastructure. In the UI, if you go to your environments, there's a little section that says GitOps clusters, and you can link your environment with your GitOps cluster. You can do that in the UI. There's also a command line command you can use. So down here, I'm going to run these cluster link commands that will then see, validated in the UI as well. So this is linking my dev cluster to my environment. This next one links my prod cluster to the environment. And then in Harness, you could have easily done it in the UI as well. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I don't have 2 separate dev and prod clusters. It's one cluster linked to 2 different environments separated by namespace. I misspoke there. My apologies. So we have a dev namespace and a prod namespace, but it's all one underlying cluster.
Yeah, it's still like the same concept. You have more than one cluster, so it's like it's just as easy to manage multiple clusters as Nick is showing here. So yeah, thanks. Nick.
All right. Okay, let's finally expand our pipeline. We have a separate YAML that's actually going to be modifying the same pipeline. So we had CI pipeline.yaml, and now we have PR pipeline.yaml. But in reality, this second YAML is just expanding on the first one. So we're actually going to be editing the same pipeline when we run apply on this. There's 2 lines we need to modify. It's shown here in the lab. As we've mentioned before, there's a lot of like placeholders for GitHub username and Docker username. If I go ahead and open this file, on line 77, there's a reference to our GitHub username. What this section is doing is it's actually pointing our pipeline to our Docker file. So this is where that workaround of deploying a different Docker image will be here in just a moment, and I'll point this out. If you've been able to follow the whole lab so far, we're updating line 77 here, and that's shown in the lab guide. And then the second place I update is line 244, I think. Okay. Give me one moment here. We'll actually create the pipeline first and then edit it if you need the workaround. So line 244, which is all the way at the bottom, you replace Docker username with your actual Docker username. And so regardless of where you are, you would complete this step here. And then run harness pipeline apply PR pipeline.yaml. Notice it is editing an existing pipeline. So like both these YAMLs for pipelines are just editing the same identifier. We just created it with CI pipeline.yaml, and then we're expanding on it with PR pipeline.yaml. So we still see the same pipeline in Harness, but we now see it's expanded. So look at the steps now, right? This is the UI representation we see. We see deploy dev, or we see CI as usual. And then we see a deploy dev stage where we deploy to our dev environment. And then there's a gated approval. So we're going to pause execution and model someone, having to give an approval before we can deploy to prod. So if I click deploy dev, what this is ultimately doing is it's using kind of a GitOps methodology of this isn't like imperative pushed deployment. Rather, we are updating our configurations in our GitOps repo with some kind of environment change or some kind of configuration change. And then on the next sync, whether it's manual or automatic, our deployment will be updated in our cluster. Likewise, if we were making a configuration change to the prod environment.
Yeah,
so
Nick,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's perfect. Just one more layer here. What Nick is showing here is like actually a workflow component of a GitOps pipeline. If you're familiar with GitOps, or Kubernetes in general, it's like Kubernetes is like notorious for like dropping the hammer. Like the second you say Kubernetes, this is my like declared state, like Kubernetes until the end of time will like try to match your state, right? You might exhaust resources, you might, something might not start, until let's keep retrying and retrying and trying until the retry interval is like, or the failure interval is like exceeded. Sometimes you need to approve something, right? Like we all work for, work for companies here, like sometimes you just need to approve a change. And the kind of the main challenge with a pure GitOps, like 100% pure GitOps approach, as low level as it sounds, like, hey, it's not made to pause, right? Or it's not like, have you ever tried to stop like a rolling deployment before? No, you might, or the finalizer will, until the finalizer executes, like, Kubernetes is going to keep executing, right? And so here you're adding in out of workflow, like, hey, this approval can take a day, right? If someone wants to validate something, you might deploy something to dev and then need to go to prod. You might have someone do some QA tests, or you might have realistically like a suite of tests or battery tests to run against it. And this is exactly how you would do that. Like you're building this experience for like other people to use, and like being biased because I work here, it's makes it easy like to expose to other people. It also made it easy to build, but Nick didn't want to steal too much or something there.
Oh, good. Yeah. So again, we haven't run the pipeline yet, or this updated pipeline. These are the steps. We'll kind of dig into these a little more in just a moment. But after that, apply to prpipeline.yaml. We've now updated our pipeline configuration. And one other change we're going to make is instead of manually running the pipeline to like manually run a build, we're going to be, again, GitOpsy and run the pipeline based off a trigger. Now, because this is an end-to-end CI/CD pipeline, this means that sometimes the pipeline might be triggered because it's a change to application source code. Sometimes the pipeline might be triggered because it's a change to the configuration or deployment manifests. But either way, GitOps says the source needs to be your Git repo. So rather than a manual run, we're now going to create a trigger that says based off like a new commit to the repository of some kind, that'll trigger a pipeline execution. This part will be done in the UI versus just a harness CLI command. So I'm going to go to triggers in the UI. And I'm going to make a new trigger. And there's a variety of different types. One of them is like just a basic webhook trigger, which we offer a GitHub configuration for. So I'm going to say a new trigger that's GitHub triggered. I'll give it a name. Doesn't really matter what I'll call it. I'll just call it trigger on push. And we already have a GitHub connector, so we can use that, right? This is part of the reusability of harness entities. So I can say using our existing GitHub connector to verify my repository here. Anytime there's a new push, maybe, to that repository, in this case, I want to trigger a pipeline run. We don't need to set a secret here. Our connector is already using our GitHub credentials, so we can ignore this part. And I'll hit continue. And now we can add conditions. Like we might be triggering based off a new push to GitHub, but like does it matter what branch? Does it matter which file paths? There's a whole variety of logical operators you can do here. So maybe if we're talking about a deployment, we might say anytime there's a push to main, in this case, this trigger will run this pipeline. You can also represent changed files and use logical operators like, is it these file paths or not these file paths, or this directory or not this directory, or this regular expression, or the file contains this string in the fully qualified path. This will completely depend on your repository setup. I'm going to make things very simple, at least for now. And just to like verify the trigger for now, because I'm not going to assume that everyone here is like a Go programmer necessarily, and podinfo is a Go program, versus like mucking around in its source code, I'm just going to say, hey, what if we change the README? Like, what if it's a docs change? There'd be more advanced regular expressions you might include here. You might say any change to any part of the repo, especially if you have like a decoupled polyrepo approach. Here, I'll just say, did we change in this case, the README file? We'll launch a new pipeline. Okay. I'll hit continue. And then everything else I can leave alone. Let me point out that we have some variables baked into our pipeline that we can change at runtime. And if I go to my GitHub repo, these are variables that are also represented in my GitOps configurations. If I go to my dev and prod environment configurations here, there are details that might need to be updated, like what is the asset ID or tag of the deployment, or what's the namespace we deployed to, or what are some like identifying informations about who did the deployment. These are also variables that are created here in Harness that will literally update this configuration, again, because GitOps, if the values are set during the pipeline's run. This is part of preserving that GitOps integrity here. So I'm going to make the trigger. All right, so page 33, page 34, page 35. And now finally, we can test the setup. In order to model a configuration change, I'm going to pretend that, let's say in my organization, we enforce that like operational changes need to be done through Harness and its permissions and its access control and its user base. So even though developers might be like pushing from Visual Studio Code, as like an operations team or a platform team, we approve environment changes through Harness. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go to my pipeline. and maybe say that we are going to update like the asset tag on our deployments. And what we're going to do is, sorry, go into my pipelines. Yep. And what we're going to do is say one of our variables that we set. So I'm going to go to this update release repo step and then expand this optional configuration. Rather than just, we might say that maybe our asset ID, rather than just being like an arbitrary runtime input, is actually going to be who deployed, like who made the change, sorry, like who made the commit to the Git repo, and then what's the commit ID. So this is a unique change on every, this is like a unique asset for every deployment because the commit shot will be unique after every commit. So I'll make this change to the dev deployment when this pipeline, and that'll be what's updated when this pipeline runs. And I'll do the same thing to prod in this case. I'll say anytime there's a change to the prod, anytime there's a change to the repo, when we deploy to prod, the corresponding asset tag or asset ID will be who made the change. So git user, and I'll just do dash. And then what's the ID of the change? What's the relevant git commit? This kind of little nuance also provides traceability because what we can also do is say, and this was done when we actually created this pipeline, the Docker image that we deploy has also been updated to say, rather than the latest tag, it'll be the trigger, the image will be tagged with the commit of whatever, the latest commit to the source code repo was. So we can kind of use this as traceability throughout our entire pipeline. All right. So this step I just did, I went ahead and saved and I updated my pipeline configuration. One moment here. Okay. If you are not able to do the CI related steps, there's a change you need to make. And rather than deploying your custom built container image, you'd be deploying from like the official pod info image that's just freely available on Docker Hub. So like you wouldn't need to run any CI builds yourself. What you would do is, I can't find it in the lab guide. I'm trying to remember where it might be. Hopefully it made it there. I'm going to try one.
What to replace? I think it's page 6 in the lab guide.
Is it page 6?
The GCR, like Stefan's like GCR. Yeah. Or page 7.
Here it is, page 7. Okay. So if you weren't able to do the CI build step, you need to do a couple things. You'd be following step 2 here. And what you would do is you would delete the CI stage entirely. So you just like delete this. So you just have deployment. And then you would change 2 lines in the PR pipeline.yaml file. And you don't need to be in, this is actually a mistake we need to update. You don't need to be in instruct to do this. You can actually do this directly within the Harness UI. So it's basically what Docker image are we deploying is the question. So on line 244 in the pipeline YAML, you would change this to the pod info image repository, which is referenced here. And then on line 249, you'd specify the image tag, and that would just be the version you deploy. And then the pipeline will just ignore any custom Docker build stuff and just, we're deploying an image, a public image that lives in a container registry. So you wouldn't have to worry about those restrictions. Let us know if you got confused on any of that. Again, you can ignore you don't need to be in instruct to do this. You can do this directly from the Harness UI here by editing the YAML directly. Okay. In my case, I'm going to trigger a new pipeline run. So let me go ahead. Bear with me one moment. I'm going to go back to page 37, which is where I was. 38. And bottom of page 37, I'm going to push a new commit. And that should trigger the end-to-end pipeline. Right now, I have this like arbitrary asset ID. So I would hope to see this updated after my pipeline completes here and here. I would also hope to see a pipeline triggered if I make a commit to this repo. Now, in this kind of contrived trigger I made, just for ease of demonstration, I just said if you change the README file, that triggers the pipeline. In reality, you'd have a more advanced regular expression that represents like a particular source code repo or source code directory that has your build files in it. So here in GitHub, I'll just commit a change. I'll add like important docs change as a line. I'll create a new commit. That'll generate a commit SHA. I'm going to commit to the main branch because I said my trigger is based off a commit to main. And looks like the commit worked. Let's look in Harness. Let me verify my trigger here in just a moment. Nicholas Lotz, Harness GitOps Workshop. I don't see it being triggered, but let me check. Trigger on push. There's my GitHub connector. I might have specified file name wrong. readme.md. Trigger.branch. Update trigger. Well, let me try one more time. There it is, just committed. I'm on main, I'm in my fork. Yep. There it is. Okay, not sure why it didn't work that first time. Okay, this is in progress. The pipeline has been triggered. And now it's starting from the beginning, right? So like we are starting with CI because this is a full end-to-end pipeline. But notice our CD configuration, our deployments will be updated as well, because we said that the deployment configuration for any new deployment should be who triggered the pipeline and then the like ID of the commit that made this change to the Git repo. So the underlying configuration for the deployments, those config.json files, will have new changes to merge as well. And this is where the PR pipeline process comes in, where again, versus just like a manual change that we would like, open up and change directly, Harness is going to do this through like a Git pull request process, such that again, we're maintaining that integrity of our source of truth is in our GitOps repository. Once this pipeline completes, I forgot to mention, be out of sync for a moment because the repo has changed. We don't have it in this pipeline example, but if you add a new step, so while this is running for a moment, if you go to your pipeline and you go to like any of the steps, so like for example here under deploy dev, you can add a new step, and one of the steps we offers are GitOps sync. So rather than like initiating a manual sync, it'll just happen automatically. So Harness will automatically do the sync as part of the pipeline, so the application is not out of sync after the pipeline's over. All right, let me go back to the deployment. Let's see, why do I have another trigger here? Let me kill this one. I know I tried triggering it twice here a little bit ago. Let me...
Maybe the approval was impending.
Yeah, that's possible. What I don't want is sometimes if you don't do triggers properly, you can get in an infinite loop, and I don't want to do that, which it looks like I did somehow, and I don't know why. The trigger should not have done that. All right, let me...
We check the trigger condition.
Yeah, let me go that. I want to stop this first. How do I do that? Where's that?
The three dots at the very top right. Yeah, abort pipeline.
Let me abort this one. So I want to go to my original deployment here, and let me go back. Okay. So let me go back to my trigger. Let's see. All right, trigger on push, GitHub connector, push, pipeline stages, all equals main, changed files equals README. Like that should be enforced.
Yep.
Okay. That should be fine. Okay. Hopefully I resolved the issue here. We'll find out. Okay. So I aborted. There was another pipeline that got triggered. What happened, folks, was there was a couple cases where I was like modifying the trigger in flight while a pipeline was already running. That might have been the issue. Either way, let me go to my original triggered execution. What do we have so far? We have our CI stage. We have a deploy to dev. Let's look at our repo. Configs, dev config, config.json. Now look at this updated asset ID. This is one of the things this PR pipeline just did, right? So as part of the deployment, it updated the GitOps configuration such that it has this new info, which is, again, the goal, have everything stored in Git. We also, if I go to Docker Hub, we also have a new image that we pushed earlier on in the CI process. I noticed this latest one, again, we have this commit tag here. That's now the commit SHA. All right. Now we have a gated approval. So the pipeline did the deploy to dev, but it paused afterwards and is saying, hey, we need someone to approve before we promote to production. If I go to my instruct environment and I see if there is anything deployed to dev, right? I see my deployment there. Actually, I do have a deployment in prod as well, because I made my GitOps application originally. It just hasn't been updated yet. So I will see a pod in prod as well. It just is out of sync in dev. All right. So you could give any kind of approval here you'd like. Looks good to me. Approved, promote to prod, whatever you want to call it. And now we're continuing. All right. That seemed to work. Now if I go to my prod directory and I look at my prod config, again, we have the updated asset ID. So the prod configuration changed. And then finally, it looks like the pipeline's done. So all of the steps, we did the build, we did the deploy to dev, we did approval, we did deploy to prod. If I go back to my GitOps application, we should now see that the application is out of sync, which we do. The parts we care about, the dev deployment and the prod deployment, because I didn't include that GitOps sync step in the pipeline, which you could easily include, it'll say, hey, the GitOps repo now looks different. There's been a change, and I haven't pulled that change into my cluster, into my deployment. So now, if I run a sync, we should see a fresh synchronization right here. And I could do that easily for prod as well. All right. So
Look at
again,
that.
this is modeling configuration changes using Harness, while again preserving that GitOps strategy of everything needs to live in Git. You can't make a change by manually clicking around like a networking console if it's not represented in Git. That's the idea. All right, folks.
That was pretty great. I mean, the last step when it executes is usually like, it might be a little bit anticlimactic, but there was a lot that was just done in this, in the last bit of the workshop here. Like we went through building something like Nick's saying, or when they're building something from Artifact, if you had the capability or if you had the email stuff, we go get that sorted out. Like using a cloud build to build an artifact, you delivered an artifact in several manifests in a very GitOps-centric fashion, using an Argo CD instance that was managed by Harness. You didn't install Argo and manage Argo. You went to more than one environment. You had an approval step in there. and also you're able to write back to the repo, right? And so like end to end, I would say like, this is a pretty realistic pipeline for most stuff that might maybe add or subtract some testing. Like, you might have some boundary steps in there, but yeah, pretty great. I'll hand it back over to Dewan and Nick just for some wrap up items. That that was the end of the technical stuff. And we can stick on for a little bit if anyone's having any trouble, but hand it back to the presenters here.
Thanks, Nick. That was fantastic. And that was a ton of information, right? Even though we spent roughly 2.5 hours together, the information we packed, that can very well be like a 10-hour workshop. So we definitely understand if this can get overwhelming. We do have both of these resources, right? So we have this detailed PDF guide that was shared with you. We also have this lightweight harness developer hub tutorial with a bunch of links. So if you need to check some resources, check some concepts, so definitely you can do that at a later time. We understand that some of you might have spent some time for troubleshooting. So for those of you, if you want to stay after the workshop, like we'll be here, we'll make sure that you can complete the workshop. But we would like to give kudos to you because you had your patience, you went through configuring your first harness pipeline, you had your applications created, and as a small token of gesture, we'd like to share this Harness University coupon code with you. Ravi, if you don't mind, like also pasting that in the chat. So that's valid for 1 year on all paid courses on Harness University. So this is the link. You can go here, you can take any one of the paid courses and get expert level knowledge on CI, CD, feature flag, whichever specific technology you'd like to learn about. We have one more request from you. This is the first time we actually delivered this workshop as Harness CI/CD Dev Days, and we understand there's a lot of room for improvement, and we'd like to hear from you what you liked, but more importantly, what you didn't like. If it's easier to type in, you can type in bit.ly/devdays-feedback, or if you have a mobile device, you can scan that QR code. It takes roughly 1 minute to fill out those information. So please let us know what we can do for future workshops, whether it's logistics, whether it's the content. We want to make sure that the content we deliver and the way we deliver, that suits your needs. Ravi and Nick, anything to add?
Yeah, folks,
That was,
thanks
that
for
was,
sticking with
go
us.
ahead,
Sorry,
Nick.
Ron. Yeah, just thanks for sticking with us. Again, it's a lot of stuff. Your feedback, we do read all feedback carefully. So any chance you have to fill out that survey, we do really take it seriously because we're going to be running future iterations of this workshop. So thank you again for your participation.
Cool. Yeah, if anybody has any trouble, we can just put in our favorite question and answer box, and we can, kind of promote you to the kind of presenter. We can just live troubleshoot it here.